Good afternoon. Today I am going to start from page number 18. Did women have a revolution? So women also joined in the revolution. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in the French society. So many of the women, they joined and they formed they brought many changes in the French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce the measures to improve their lives. Most women of the third estate, now women were already from the third estate, had to work for a living. They have to do the work just to look after their house. They worked as a seamstresses and laundresses, sold flowers, fruits and vegetables at the market. So many of the women, they worked like laundry, washermen, and flowers, selling flowers, fruits and vegetables in the market, and were employed as a domestic servants in the houses of a prosperous people. Many of the women, they worked in some rich family also. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Many of the women have not got the proper job, even proper education, and even the job training. Only daughters of the nobles were wealthier. Members of the third estate could study at a convent. Only the daughters of the noble high family, they could have their good education, and they could marry even. Working women had also to care for their families. The working women also to look after their families, that is cook, fetch water, queue up for the bread. They have to stand in a line for taking a bread also, and look after the children. Their wages were very low than those of men. They were getting a money with a very less amount in compared to men. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspaper. Now most of the women, they did, they have started their own club and the newspaper. About 60 women's clubs came up in the different French cities. Now in these French cities, near about 60 were the women's clubs. The Society of the Revolutionary and Republican Women was most famous of them. Some of the women who were revolutionary and the Republican women, they were becoming very famous. One of their main demands was the women enjoy the same political rights as the men. Now in these clubs, some of the women were also enjoying the same rights as the men were having. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them a passive citizen. They demanded, you have read in the passive citizen, in this passive citizen on page numbers, page number 10, figure number 7. Active citizens, those who are entitled for the vote, and passive citizens, those who were not getting the right to the vote. Now here it's written, right to the vote in the early, here it's written, in the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of the women. Together with the creation of the state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all the girls. Now, that time when the women were joining the revolutionary, some of the women were getting the education, some of the girls were getting the proper education. Their father could not longer force them to marry. They were not forced to into the marriage against with their will. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely and registered under civil law. The marriage was becoming a civil law also. Divorce was made legal. It's a legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for the jobs also, could become artists or run small business. Now women were they were working in different things, in different jobs. Some were artists, becoming artists, and some were running the small business. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. Now this struggle was continuing. They wanted to have the equal political rights. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of the women's club and banning their political activities. Now They were running the women's club and they started banning the political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and number of them were executed. Number of women were executed. Women's movement of the voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The example of the political activities of the French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. So this was their revolution they have kept in the French in the 20th century. The example of the political activities of the French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. So 1946 was the main year when the women had got the right to vote. You will read yourself source number E, F and source number G. Now come to the next fifth section, the abolition of the slavery. The abolition of the slavery. Now no more slavery was there. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was abolition of the slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, now some abolition of slavery were there. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and Saint Domingo were important suppliers of the commodities such as tobacco, indigo and sugar and coffee. So these were the three colonies of the Caribbean where the commodities were already supplied, like tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. But the reluctance of the Europeans to go and work in the distant and unfamiliar lands mean a shortage of labor on the plantation. Now for these plantations, tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee, they need more and more labor. So this was met by a triangular slave. Now there were triangular slave trade was there between Europe, African and Americans where the plantation was supplied. The slave trade began in the 17th century. You have to underline this sentence. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports. Now so many ports were there, Bordeaux or Nantes, to the African coast where these labor were sailed, where they brought slaves from local chieftains. These labor were brought from different areas. Branded and shackled, they were tightly kept into the ship. They were branded and shackled. And the 3-month long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. So it took a 3-month long voyage. There they were sold into the plantation owners. Then these slaves were sold to the plantation owners when they are brought. The exploitation of the slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in the European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes, they were the port cities, owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Now these cities, these ports had become very famous, Bordeaux and Nantes. Throughout the 18th century, there was a little criticism about the slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of the men should be extended to all the French subjects, including those in the colonies. But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposing from the businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. Now, big businessmen, they were depending on these slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all the slaves. Now that was the last convention when the labor was, they were already free from all the slaves. Then this however turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, now after the 10 years, what happened? Napoleon reintroduced again the slavery. Napoleon reintroduced the slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes. Now plantation owners also, they wanted to give the freedom to those African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. Now, this was the year when the slavery was totally abolished. Now, tomorrow I will start from 6th unit, the revolution and the everyday life.